It's the 2022 World Cup.
It's the squad update for Costa Rica. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin, and today we will be updating Costa Rica's squad for the 2022 World Cup. So we've done a podcast on the groups, which took a close look at Costa Rica's team, as well as a player media cast, which went through each of the candidates for making the final squad. And that one ended with a prediction of the starters. And we also put out a shortened version of each of those. This media cast is an addendum to that. In other words, we won't be repeating all of that information, but we'll be simply adding on to it. It's not necessary to listen to that version or the previous versions, but you should know that the conclusions that we draw here are largely based on what we analyzed there and explained in more detail there, of course. So we do recommend the full player podcast and the team podcast. If we have time, we're hoping to release a player version focused solely on the final squad, just giving the bio information to those players selected for the final squad. Well, that final squad has been released, and Costa Rica didn't release a preliminary squad, just the final squad. So today we'll find out how accurate we were in our predictions. We're going to list the names of the candidate that we considered the candidates that we consider definite, likely, and possible, and then we'll announce who made the final squad. As we guessed, most squads had a few surprises, some players who didn't make it, or new and unexpected players who did. So we'll go over those players and summarize them again at the end. We'll give a little bio information if we on new players, because we didn't do that in the main podcast. And also we'll discuss whether the selections and the games played since June 22 to 2022 have changed our thoughts on our predicted starters and on the team's progress. So we'll kind of end with a little bit of our closing thoughts. Once again, I am embarrassing myself. I don't have a Costa Rican team shirt, so I'm doing my laughable close approximation of colors here. So sorry, Costa Rican fans, but this is as close as I can get. All right, let's look at the formations for the recent games. So we did do an analysis of formations in the full player podcast there. So we'll focus our attention here on the recent friendlies. So we are, I think, 8 days out. Today is November 11th. So they played 2 games. Actually, they played a game against Nigeria, friendly against Nigeria, but we didn't have time to take that into account here. So we just have those 2 friendlies against South Korea, and also against Uzbekistan. That was kind of a little mini friendly tournament in South Korea. So that was a 2-2 draw with South Korea, and a 2-1 win over Uzbekistan there. And well, I can at least report the result for the friendly against Nigeria. That was a win. It was a 2-0 win. So they seem to be doing well, actually, in their friendlies. I should say, actually, that the friendly against South Korea basically seemed like the starters that they will choose, most of the first team players there. On the other hand, the game against Uzbekistan was very experimental, and kind of threw us for a bit of a loop. But we don't think those will be that will be the starting lineup, but maybe testing out a few players in different positions or a few of the newer players. In terms of formation, the game against South Korea was a 4-4-2 formation, which they use fairly regularly, and the game against Uzbekistan was a 4-3-3 formation, which they sometimes use, but not as often as the 4-4-2. So we concluded in the last podcast that the preferred formation was kind of the 4-2-3-1, or the I'd say the 4-2-3-1 was quite common, but they did experiment with various formations. All right, let's move on to talk about the squad. So we kind of have the list of players that we introduced last time, and we'll use that as our basis. So Luis Fernando Suarez is the manager and remains the manager. He's been in charge of Costa Rica since 2021. Again, if you want the full details on these players and manager, the full-length podcast has that, but we won't be repeating all of that here. Let's move to goalkeepers, and we have as definite candidates Keylor Navas and Lionel Moreira, and as a likely candidate Aaron Cruz. And well, I won't go over the next unless they're significant. I will say possible candidate was Esteban Alvarado, and then seemingly off the squad we won't do. But we do have a new player to introduce to the mix here, and that is Patrick Sequeira. Patrick Sequeira, and now we can announce the selections for the final squad. It is a definite candidate Keylor Navas, but a bit of a surprise here. We had Lionel Moreira as a definite, but he did not make the squad. Oh my God, we're off to a bad start in our predictions. Also, the likely candidate, Aaron Cruz, was not selected for the squad, but the possible candidate, Esteban Alvarado, was selected for the squad there, and also selected for the squad was the new candidate, Patrick Sequeira. So let's talk a little bit about these candidates here. So we'll kind of summarize by talking about the September friendlies mostly. But Alvarado, it was Esteban Alvarado who started the first of the September friendlies, and Aaron Cruz the second, but we know Aaron Cruz was not selected. I should add that Sequeira was subbed into both games there. Meanwhile, Keylor Navas was not on the bench. So a couple of comments on the players here. Keylor Navas reported in injured with a back injury just in time for the games. He was expected back on November 10th and is back in action. I'm a bit suspicious of that, actually, because he does miss quite a few of the less important games. But we'll talk about at the end whether that affects our view of him being the starter. Meanwhile, the Lionel Moreira, really no particular reason was given for him and other candidates, likely candidates we thought were likely or definite, for not being selected. Other than the suggestion that Patrick Sequeira, the goalkeeper who was selected, was a future starter. So it may be an age matter. Lionel Moreira is 32 years old, and Aaron Cruz, who was not selected, is 31 years old. And it had seemed more like Moreira and Cruz seemed more likely given their participation to June 2022. So perhaps it's with an eye to rebuilding the future. But I gotta say, if that's the case, it's a bit late and a bit abrupt. I'll introduce Patrick Sequeira. He's actually not a new player for the squad. He returned after a 14-month absence in September 2022 and didn't start any of their remaining games in September, as we said, but was subbed in for both matches. So those were his first two starts for Costa Rica. However, he has been on the squad since 2018, the 23-year-old. And in fact, he was part of the Gold Cup 2021 squad. He was on the roster there and saw no action in the tournament, but he was supposed to start game 3, but he injured his ankle in the warm-up there. So Patrick Sequeira, however, he was not selected after the Gold Cup in 2021. In September 22, the manager selects him for the final squad to give him experience. I'm presuming, but one wonders why he didn't select him all the way from the Gold Cup until September 2022. But there we have it, Patrick Sequeira, and that's kind of our presumption was that it's about being a younger player and maybe developing for the future. So yeah, a bit of complication, a bit of surprise with goalkeepers. We're going to get rid of the candidates who didn't make it here. And yeah, Keylor Navas, Esteban Alvarado, and Patrick Sequeira making the squad. Let's move on to defenders. And we are going to cover central defenders and... no, sorry, I'm losing my head there. Okay, Oscar Duarte is the first of the definite candidates in central defense. And actually, we have also Francisco Calvo. And actually, during the full play mediacast, we recoded him as a central defender. We didn't recode him, but we moved him to this section. He's primarily coded as a left defender, but he's been playing in central defense, so we moved him here. Juan Pablo Vargas, also a definite candidate, and Kendall Waston, also a definite candidate. So we have 4 central defenders who are definite candidates. Beyond that, we don't have any who are in the likely or possible category. And the other candidates we introduced during the podcast were in the seems to be off the squad category. So we're going to delete them from this discussion because none of them made the squad. And all of the others did. So we have central defenders, Oscar Duarte, Francisco Calvo, Juan Pablo Vargas, and Kendall Waston, all 4 of them making the squad. So we'll finish with central defenders just by describing the general trend in September friendlies in terms of the position. So actually a variety of players had come in and out since the 2021 Gold Cup. Some of them not even central defenders. But in the playoff game with New Zealand that got them to this cup, they came back to Calvo and Duarte, and they had been the most prominent pairing in the 2021 Gold Cup and in the first half of qualifying. So a lot of the experimentation took place in the second half of qualifying. In the September friendly, Calvo and Duarte started the first game, the one where they seemed to use their starters. In the second game, it was defensive midfielder Gallo and Juan Pablo Vargas starting the second game. So we'll tell you at the end who we think the starters are going to be. But there we have it, the central defenders. Let's move on to left backs. And for candidates, we had Brian Oviedo as a definite candidate. We'll just mention again that Francisco Calvas is coded as a left back, but we moved him to central defense there, Francisco Calvo. So Brian Oviedo is a definite, Ronald Matarrita as a likely candidate, and Ian Lawrence as a possible candidates. And let's look at who made it. And we have Brian Oviedo making the squad, and Ronald Matarrita also making the squad. Possible candidate Ian Lawrence not selected for the squad there. So let's take a look at the position. Matarrita seemed to be making a bid as a starter since the 2021 Gold Cup. But ultimately, the manager favored veteran Oviedo. So Oviedo started both of the September friendlies. So looks like he's the prime candidate there. And moving on to right backs, we're really moving through things here. Okay, as a definite candidate, we have Keisha Fuller. And as a likely candidate, we had Carlos Martinez. And as a possible candidate, we had Ricardo Blanco. So none of the other candidates made it there. Oh, and actually, I kind of jumped the gun on who made it. Keisha Fuller, the definite candidate, did make the final squad. Carlos Martinez, the likely candidate, also made it. However, Richard Blanco, the possible candidate, did not make it. So farewell, Ricardo Blanco there. And let's take a look at the position. So the manager had favoured veterans here too. So Fuller was looking the most likely through most of the period after the 2021 Gold Cup. However, Carlos Martinez had been making inroads and significantly was subbed in to replace Fuller at halftime in that crucial playoff game with New Zealand. But the September, we were kind of hoping the September games would provide some clarity as to whether Fuller or Martinez was looking like the starter. However, the September friendlies just created more confusion. It was Martinez in the first game, but in the second game, the experimental one, it was centre back Kendall Waston, appearing in the right back position, and Keisha Fuller appeared as a right forward. So not really sure what to make of that, but we'll come back to it when we try to predict our starting lineup. Let's move on to the midfield, and we're going to combine defensive midfielders and central midfielders here because the positions often overlap. So in the defensive midfield, we have Daniel Chacon as a definite candidate, and we had Orlando Gallo as a definite candidate also. In the possible level, we had Douglas Lopez and Houston Salas. We won't go beyond that. Pretty familiar names actually, and players that seem to be off the squad there. Jefferson Brenes and David Guzman not making the squad, but they hadn't been with the team, playing with the team. Okay, I got off topic, I'll admit it. We're focusing on the players who did make it. Central midfielders, we have Celso Borges as a definite candidate, and Yeltsin Tejada also as a definite. And at the possible level, we have Wilson Rowan. Sorry, I said that backwards. Rowan Wilson. Okay, so those are all the candidates. Let's look and see who made it. So back to defensive midfielders. Daniel Chacon, yes, he made it. Orlando Gallo, well, we think he would have made the squad as a definite candidate. However, he got a doping ban from late October, and that ban continues until March 2023. So a bit of a loss for them there, Orlando Gallo. Meanwhile, Douglas Lopez did make the squad. This is a possible candidate, and the other possible candidate, Houston Salas. So I'm sure one of those would not have been selected had Orlando Gallo not been banned. Among the central midfielders, no surprise that Celso Borges was selected, and Yeltsin Tejada also selected. They were both definite candidates. And possible candidate Rowan Wilson also selected. So there's a lot of central midfielders available to them, and we'll just kind of summarize the position there. So Borges and Tejada became the central pairing after the 2021 Gold Cup, but Orlando Gallo and newcomer Chacon were making inroads into the position. Well, not into that position, but into the team, because they were showing up in other positions as well. However, the manager returned to veterans Borges and Tejada for the crucial playoff game against New Zealand. And in the September friendlies, we saw Borges and Chacon in game one, so Chacon replacing Tejada there. And we saw attacking midfielder Aguilera as the lone central midfielder in the 4-3-3 of the second game. That was the experimental game, but I wouldn't make too much of that. Tejada, meanwhile, was not on the squad. However, Tejada was selected for the final squad, which was after those September games. So he's still in the picture. Let's move on to left midfield. And we have here Johan Venegas as a definite candidate. And we have, well, we have Gerson Torres actually, but we moved him over to the right side. I'm going to do that on the graphic right here. We moved Gerson Torres to the right winger position, and we'll come to him shortly. Okay, and so none of the possible but unlikely or seem to be off the squad made it. However, we do have a new candidate in Alvaro Zamora, a new candidate in this position. And so let me tell you a little bit about Alvaro Zamora. He got his first cap in September 2022, and he didn't start any of the 2 games there, but he was subbed in at halftime for both matches. So Alvaro Zamora, his first 2 caps there in 2022. He is 20 years old, and he plays for Saprissa, one of the main clubs in Costa Rica. So yeah, a bit of a surprise there. Just coming onto the radar. And in terms of who made the squad, well, both of them. So Johan Venegas, which was no surprise as he was definite, and Alvaro Zamora, one of the surprises in the team selection. So let's take a look at the position. Generally, it was Venegas playing left midfielder in the first half of the period we're talking about. So that would be games from after the 2021 Gold Cup to June 2022, mostly World Cup qualification games. So Venegas in the first half, and defensive midfielder Orlando Gallo, or Chacon in the second. As I said, those 2 players kind of popping up in various places. In the September friendlies, the position wasn't used in game 1, but right winger Carlos Mora played the position in game 2, although we'll later see that Carlos Mora did not make the squad. So yeah, left midfield covered there. Let's move on to right midfield. And for candidates, actually, we only have candidates in the possible but unlikely or in the off the squad. So no candidates for right midfield, actually. So let's move on to left wingers. And there we have a likely candidate in Jewison Bennett. And that's all we have over there. The other candidates are seemingly off the squad. So Jewison Bennett did make the squad. And okay, so let me describe the situation in this. We'll call it the left attacking quadrant, which includes left wingers, left attacking midfielders, and left forwards. And in this position, it was a lot of players in what was a bit of a mess. But Jewison Bennett seemed to emerge, and he played left wing in the first of the September friendlies also. That kind of suggests he may be the starter in that position. Attacking midfielder Aaron Suarez played left forward in the second game, though we're going to see that Aaron Suarez was not selected for the squad. So let's move over to the right wingers. And you saw me move Gerson Torres over here. We have him as a likely candidate, and also a likely candidate, Carlos Mora. And here too, we have a new candidate. Oh, sorry, I should have said we also have possible candidate Alonso Martinez. Okay, we have a new candidate in Anthony Hernandez here. So let me tell you a little bit about him, since we didn't cover him in the player podcast. He got his first cap in September 2022. That's why he wasn't on our radar. And he didn't start any of the remaining 2 games there, but he too was subbed in for both matches. So Anthony Hernandez being tried out just before the cup here. Okay, let's look at who made it. And we have Gerson Torres making the squad. However, a bit of a surprise that likely candidate Carlos Mora did not make the squad, and neither did possible candidate Alonso Martinez, so we'll delete him from the list. And Anthony Hernandez did make the squad, so sneaking in there just before the Cup. Anthony Hernandez, good for him. Okay, let's summarize the position or tell you what happened with the position. So we think that it seems like they would like to have Joel Campbell on the right wing, kind of feeding the forwards, but a lack of scoring forwards forces them to move Campbell up to the forward position. So Gerson Torres emerged as the player to replace him as the right winger. And Gerson Torres did start as right winger in the first September friendly. And then bafflingly in that very experimentative second game, it was right back Ricardo Fuller starting as a right forward in the second game. So make of that what you will, but it kind of threw us for a loop. Okay, that's right wingers, and we'll move on to the forward line where we include attacking midfielders. So the candidates here are Brian Ruiz as a definite candidate and Brandon Aguilera as a likely candidate. We mentioned Aaron Suarez before. He was possible but unlikely and didn't make the squad. And we'll say goodbye to those candidates who were never likely to make it. So Brian Ruiz, the definite candidate, was selected. In fact, he was the first on the manager's list, so the manager said. And Brandon Aguilera, although he's coded as an attacking midfielder, actually the games he did play were as a central midfielder. But no matter what position he is used in, he did make the squad. So there he is, available to the manager to use wherever he wants. Okay, let's summarize the position. And in fact, this position of attacking midfielder is not often used in the formations they put out. But when it was usually Brian Ruiz. But that was fairly few and far between. And the position was not used at all in the September friendlies. So there we have it. On to forwards. Well, Joel Campbell is classified as a forward. We think the manager would like to use him as a right winger, but that's just speculation. Anyway, the first candidate is Joel Campbell, a definite candidate in our opinion, and Anthony Contreras, who we also considered a definite candidate. We had a likely candidate in Jose Guillermo Ortiz. And we didn't have any in the possible category, so everyone below that is kind of deleted from our list here. And in terms of those who made it, Joel Campbell was selected for the squad, as was Anthony Contreras, both of our definite candidates. However, our likely candidate, Jose Guillermo Ortiz, was basically is... Well, it's a little unsure what the situation. So let me just tell you, he was out with a cruciate ligament surgery actually since April 2022, and he was expected back in late October, which would have been in time for the Cup. And he remained on the injured list until late September, but then by early November he was not on the injury list. I couldn't find actually club data from October 2nd onwards, but whether he was playing for his club or not. But anyway, he seems to have recovered from the surgery is the point. However, he was not selected, and I wonder if it's because he would require some time to return to fitness after his cruciate ligament surgery. Regardless, all we know for sure is that he wasn't selected for the squad, and a bit of a surprise there since we had considered him a likely candidate, maybe due to injury. And that is it for the players. So we'll come back to that. We'll come back to talk about who we think are the likely starters among all those candidates. Meanwhile, we're going to go over a few stats based on the 26 players that were selected. So we did some of these. We did these stats based on all of the candidates available to them in the previous podcast. So now we're narrowing it down to these 26. The average age is 27.2, and we have 7 players who are 33 or older. Most notably Brian Ruiz, who is 37, Keylor Navas, the goalkeeper, 35, and Celso Borges, 34. And we have 7 players who are 22 or younger. And most significant among those are Daniel Chacon, 21 years old, Anthony Contreras, 22 years old, and Jewison Bennett, just 18 years old. So those players are kind of getting starts. That's why I'm pointing them out. Brandon Aguilera is 19 years old, also quite young there. The average number of caps among these players is 43.2 among the 26 players. So that is slightly above average there. So a fairly experienced squad, which is why the manager tended to go with older players. The total number of goals is 123 among the 26 players, and the total goals per cap is 11.6. So that number in itself doesn't mean much, but it means more when we compare it with other teams. So the average when we did the full player podcast was 13.1%, so 11.6, quite a bit below that. And we have seen that they are struggling to find a main scorer. Anyway, there's more details on those kind of stats in the full length podcast, but we're just kind of racing through in this one. So let's move on to the next section where we kind of summarize some of the important things. So first is notable non-selections. So goalkeeper Lionel Moreira we had as a definite candidate, so that one really took us by surprise. Aaron Cruz, also the goalkeeper that we thought was likely to make the squad, not selected either. Orlando Gallo, defensive midfielder Orlando Gallo. I consider this a fairly significant loss for them. We had him as a definite candidate, but he received a doping ban, which carries through the World Cup. So he loses his opportunity there. And finally, Carlos Mora, the right winger, who we had as a likely candidate. So again, more details on that in the main podcast. I'm going to put next surprise inclusions. So we'd have to put Patrick Sequeira there next. We could regard him as a new player, but that wouldn't be accurate since he was on the squad for the 2021 Gold Cup. So he's more like a surprise returning player. And we talked about him when we talked about goalkeepers above. But new players, we have Alvaro Zamora, a left midfielder, 20 years old there, and Anthony Hernandez, a right winger, 21 years old. So those players got their first caps in September. So they weren't on our radar for the full length podcast. Let's take a look at some injuries, updates on injuries. So we had couple of players who seemed to recover from injury there. One of them is Keylor Navas, so reported in with a back injury for the September games, but seemed to be back in action. As I said, I'm a bit skeptical about whether he really was injured there. We do have Jose Guillermo Ortiz, and I'm kind of speculating a bit here that this is an injury that kept him off the roster. So he was dropped due to injury. Jose Guillermo Ortiz, although he did kind of recover from his operations, I'm guessing that it was a fitness issue, a returning to fitness issue, but it may be just a simple non-selection there. Finally, we have basically a new category dropped due to a banning, Orlando Gallo in that category, not making the squad here. So, all right. Well, it is time for us to move on to the predictions for starters. Okay, I did a quick edit there to populate my list of predicted starters, and now I'm back with that list. All right. Well, manager Luis Fernando Suarez has not been fired, so we'll regard him as a starter. Moving on to goalkeepers, we'll actually name the players just kind of in summary. So, Keylor Navas, a definite candidate. Well, we won't do definite, possible, or anything else. We'll say Keylor Navas, Esteban Alvarado, and Patrick Sequeira. So, as I said, I think the back injury is suspect, and Navas often misses games of lesser importance. So we think it'll be a miraculous recovery for the Cup, and we still consider him the starter. We did think Moreira was second and Aaron Cruz was making a bid for third. Now it's hard to say whether Alvarez or Sequeira is the second string goalkeeper. I kind of give the nod to Alvarado there. I think I've been saying his name wrong. I think Alvarado will be second string. Okay, let's move on to central defenders. So we have Oscar Duarte, Francisco Calvo, Juan Pablo Vargas, and Kendall Waston. And we had nominated Calvo and Duarte as the starting pair, and we are sticking to that. Okay, let's look at left back. So we have Brian Oviedo and Ronald Matarrita. And we had predicted Oviedo in the previous podcast, and he started both of the September friendlies, which reinforced our certainty that he will be the starter. Sorry, I should be highlighting these. So Keylor Navas, the goalie, Duarte and Calvo, the starting central defenders, we think. Brian Oviedo as the starting left back. Moving over to the right side, that's a bit confusing. It seemed like Carlos Martinez was putting in a challenge for the starting spot over Fuller. And in the previous podcast, the full-length one, we used yellow highlights on both of them, kind of hedging our bet there. The September games confused the issue with Martinez starting in the first and central defender Waston starting the second game, with Fuller appearing as a right forward. So we think that makes Martinez's case a bit stronger, but we're still going to hedge our bets by saying that it could be both of them rotating or either one of them. We think both of them will get starts. I'm actually beginning to lean a bit more towards Martinez there, if truth be told. Okay, for defensive and central midfielders, we have Daniel Chacon, we have Douglas Lopez and Houston Salas. Those are all defensive midfielders. And Celso Borges, Yeltsin Tejada, and Rowan Wilson. Those are all central midfielders. And we concluded that Borges and Tejada were the starting pair. Chacon and Gallo, who didn't make the squad or who was banned, seemed important, though. And replacing not only players in the central midfielder, but in central defense and on the wings too, on the outside midfield. So we had highlighted both Chacon and Gallo as sometimes starters, but since Gallo is off the squad, we will highlight just Daniel Chacon as some. We think he'll start some games. But the September friendlies leave us thinking Borges is the definite starter there, and we've grown a bit doubtful on Yeltsin Tejada, so we're downgrading him to yellow. I think he was green at the end of the previous podcast, but we're downgrading Yeltsin Tejada to yellow because we think Daniel Chacon might be a partner with Borges, maybe in a rotating position or maybe even stealing the spot. Okay, that's a bit complicated. Let's move on to left midfield. And we picked Johan Venegas, but as a definite starter, but not necessarily as a left midfielder. So sometimes the position is not used. Sometimes, as we said, Chacon or someone else plays in that position. So based on the individual, though, we think Johan Venegas will definitely be a starter. In fact, we saw him starting as a forward, which he sometimes does, actually, a very versatile player. So Johan Venegas, a starter. On the left wing, we felt a bit bold, actually, at the end of the last podcast, nominating Jewis and Bennett as a starter. But we forged ahead and did that. September actually added a bit of confidence to our opinion there, with Bennett starting one of the two. So we're going to stick with him as a starter, but we're a little less confident than we are about some of our other picks. On the right wing, we didn't actually highlight Gerson Torres in the full-length player podcast, but we did say that we saw him getting a couple of starts, especially if Joel Campbell is drafted into a forward position. So we shall enshrine that prediction by highlighting him in yellow here as a sometime starter, but it kind of depends what happens on the forward line there. Attacking midfielders, we said the position was really not used enough to nominate a starter for this position. The manager did say that Brian Ruiz was the first player selected for the squad, but we see him as a substitute rather than as a starter. So no highlight for you, Brian Ruiz. And finally, on the forward line, we have Joel Campbell and Anthony Contreras. Jose Guillermo Ortiz is out with basically injury, and we think Joel Campbell and we think actually both of them are going to be starters. So Joel Campbell and Anthony Contreras, as they continue to try to work out their forward line, trying to find a player who actually puts the ball in the net. So Anthony Contreras has not done badly as far as that goes. So we think they'll at least start with him, and really not many candidates up there. So we can see why they drafted in Venegas, the left midfielder. So I think that's going to be a problem in the cup. And it actually leads us on to the last section, closing thoughts. So I honestly got to say, I find some of the manager's decisions erratic. At the beginning of qualification for World Cup, we felt he was ignoring the need for rejuvenation. And then when he finally got around to adding more youth, it seemed too late. I mean, the most illustrative example of that is ignoring goalkeeper Patrick Sequeira after the Gold Cup, where he was a backup keeper, and relying on goalkeepers who were all in their 30s. And then in the selection, abandoning two of those goalkeepers, veteran goalkeepers, to go back to Sequeira. I just don't get it. So we were kind of saying all the way through qualification that they needed to introduce some youth to the team. And they actually have introduced some youth to the team. And, you know, some of them are even kind of making their way into the team. But, you know, we feel it would have been better if they had kind of started that process earlier. They had 2 Gold Cups to kind of do that, but really only started doing it halfway through qualification. Nevertheless, I mean, I don't want to be too critical. We didn't really give Costa Rica much of a chance to do well in this cup, and we kind of still feel that way. He's been trying out a lot of new names in a lot of positions, even up until the very end. And the last friendly was really a hodgepodge of using players out of position. So the team is kind of aging, and rejuvenation doesn't seem to have gone far enough. So we're kind of sticking with our opinion that they won't do very well in the cup. But we'll have to go through some rebuilding after the cup. But, we may be wrong, and I like Costa Rica, so I certainly wouldn't mind if they did do well in the Cup. They were so exciting in 2014. Anyway, those are the closing thoughts on Costa Rica, and that brings us to the end of the podcast. So keep in mind that we will be, or we may be doing a final media cast, just going through the players who made the squad and giving the biographical information on them, but that depends on whether we have time to do it, basically. Anyway, thank you for listening, and check the show notes or check the show notes for links, or look for soccerphiles. Canada. Sorry, I should put the closing graphic up here. Soccerphiles.captivate.fm, or you can search Soccerphiles on Google or in YouTube. That's Soccerphiles with a PH and in the middle and an S at the end. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you for our next update podcast. Bye-bye.